So I want to take a moment and just go over some terms that you'll hear when you're working in web programming and being a web developer and creating websites. So we're going to look at some terminology, and then when we're done looking at this terminology, just some phrases that you'll hear when you're working as a web developer and words you'll hear. And I just want to make sure you're clear on them, that we're all clear on them. After we're done looking at different terminology, I also want to just step back and look at sort of the document structure stuff because I want to point out Alexa, which is an interesting website. I want to give you some statistics on search engines because structuring your documents correctly, having a good outline, that's going to contribute to how well you rank in search engines. And then I want to give you an article that you could read on your own about that. And I want to show you this outliner tool, how you get the outliner tool. So we'll see that at the end. All right, that's preview. Here's the material. Here's the body. Here's the meat. So the first term you should be aware of is a document. And a document is another way we could just refer to a web page. So a document is a web page. That's it. Okay. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about a document, and what they're talking about is the web page. The next thing for you to be aware of is the document object model. And so there you can see documents being used. Well, what is the document object model? The document object model is a model of the objects on a document. Maybe they should have called it the mod, but they didn't, right? So what does that mean, document object model? A model of the object on the documents. So we could Google DOM, and we could go to images, and there's a lot of images which aren't about web programming, but here is one. And so here we have a model of the objects that are on the document. So we have the document, and the document has an HTML object or element or tag. And then, HTML has a head and a body. The head has a title, and it has the text my title in it. And then the body has these other tags. So this is a model of the objects which are on the document. That's it, document object model. And browsers, when they receive all the text, right, when you ask for a web page, it sends you a bunch of text, and then the browser uses that. The browsers will render the DOM. They go through and they look at all the DOM and then display a web page. That's the document object model. So elements versus tags. I'm pretty loosey-goosey about using the word elements or tags. To me, they're tags. They look like tags. I'm working with tags. I'm putting tags on my page, so I often call them tags. But I just want to make sure that we're clear about the difference between an element and a tag, even if it's, the difference is very subtle, kind of like the difference between an automobile and a car. Yeah, there's a difference, but it's pretty subtle difference. So here are tags. This is the opening and closing paragraph tag, and here is the paragraph element. It's the P, right? So that's elements versus tags. And I'll use them interchangeably, but I've been reading a bunch of documentation. A lot of documentation, they talk about elements. So I just want to make sure you're clear on that. Sometimes you'll hear div soup and divitis. What is div soup and divitis? If you go and you look at some web pages, like here's Reddit, and then we right-click it and we say view page source. And that's not what I want. I want right-click inspect. And you can see there's a ton of divs in here, right? So this is divitis or div soup, div. And a div is just another container, and it's a block level container, so it takes up a whole line and it's on its own line versus an inline element, right, where it's inline with other stuff. So that's what div and divitis is. All right. Structure versus layout. We've already kind of talked about that. We're going to structure our document into different sections. And then later, structure it first, and then we'll do the outline, and then we'll do the layout. So I just want to make sure that structure versus layout is clear. Semantic HTML is HTML that has meaning. HTML that has meaning, right? So different tags that have meaning. So if you look up what semantic means, it's kind of like, semantic means. It's related to meaning in language or logic. Semantic means. I don't know, that's kind of funny. So that's what it is. So what is it in practice? Well, a div, it doesn't convey any meaning. It doesn't tell me about anything about the content that's enclosed within a div tag. It's just like, here's some content, that's it. But a header, things that are inside a header tag, well, that tells me something. Or things that are inside a footer tag, that tells me something. And so those tags, in their nature, convey meaning. By their very name, convey meaning. So those are semantic tags, okay? Semantic HTML. So then I have a couple of links here. We will use these links when we're learning about, sectioning off our documents, creating document structure, okay? And they will also inform us, we'll also use them when we create the outline, right? To create the outline. And that all builds towards layout, so they do contribute to layout. So you'll see this layout of these three documents from MDN, Mozilla Developers Network. You'll see this layout throughout these notes. And so that's just for us to be able to go back and reference each of these things right here. And we could see we're going to learn about content categories. So content categories, all elements fall into one or more content category. And so this will describe, when we look at the documentation, I want you to be able to read and understand documentation, so you're going to learn that. But this will describe kind of what the element is and what it does, right? So different content categories. So for instance, one of the content categories we will look at would be like flow content. Elements belonging to the flow content category typically contain text or embedded content. And these are the ones. And then sectioning content. Elements belonging to the sectioning content model create a section in the current outline that defines the scope of header footer elements and heading content. Interesting, right? But that tells us how article, side, nav, and section work. And so we'll understand that more fully as we get into things. But knowing like what is flow content. So if we look at MDN element list, right? So here's all the elements, and then we're like, okay, I want to know how to use like the header element, and then we come in here and we're like, okay, how does it work? Because tags nest, right? So which tags can I nest within the header element? And it says permitted content, flow content, but no header or footer descendant. So any content could go in there, which is flow content. So I could come back over here and I could look at flow content. Any of these elements can be nested within the header tags. So that's how you start figuring out, how do I work with HTML? So just like an unordered list or an ordered list, you can nest LIs, list items, right? Like, okay, so this is what we could put in a UL or an LI. We could put in LIs, right? UL or an OL, we could put LIs in there. So anyhow, you got to figure out what could be nested within what, and knowing like, okay, here the header allows flow content, but without those, okay, here's the flow content. That's what could go in there. You definitively know now from one of the most accurate sources, okay, this is what I could put in those tags. So that's a really big piece. So, looking at content categories and HTML element reference right here, right, looking at content sectioning, and then sections and outlines on an HTML5 document, we're going to see all that and use these documents to understand sectioning. So that you'll see these three documents linked. That's the main takeaway. You'll see those three documents linked throughout the rest of this outline here of the course. So terminology, that's what we're just looking at, kind of getting a lay of the land, making sure we understand the different terms we'll hear, like document object model and document, difference between elements and tags, where do we look at the documentation, and that's the main thing we're working on right here. So one thing you also hear is you'll hear about explicit sections and implicit sections. So as we're doing this, you're going to hear explicit sections and implicit sections. So as we create sections, we section up our document. We can create those sections explicitly or implicitly. And this is for creating the outline, right? So the word section gets used like in many different places in the stuff we're talking about. It's kind of like there, and there. There could be, 3 different uses of the same word pretty much, right? So section, has many different uses. There's the section element. So that's one of the elements. And you can see that section element right here. Section, right? There's different sections. So here's a section, here's a section, here's a section, which are defined by different elements, right? And then in the outline, they talk about sections. So it's kind of crazy, right? But when we create a section or when we create our outline, we could create explicit sections with these and implicit sections with those. So that's just a preview, and we'll learn more about that. The next term, just terminology here, and that's okay if you're not clear on these. That's right. You're probably feeling a little bit like, wait a minute, I'm not totally clear on that. That's okay. I'm just exposing you to it, and then, the more we talk about it, the more it's going to start to click. But there's always got to be that initial exposure where like, this is new, and then after a while it becomes familiar. All right, that's the initial exposure. The next term you need to know about is document flow. And so you'll hear people talk about the flow of a document, right? And all that means is how the different elements stack and line up on the page. So we've talked about block and inline elements, right? So, some elements are block elements, some elements are inline block, and that's how they're displayed. So, I'm just going to put display right there, and default display block inline. There we go. And so yeah, so how do those then line up? So that's when people talk about the document flow, that's the document flow. How do the elements line up or stack up on the page? So block elements are stacking up, inline elements are lining up, and that's the document flow. And I kind of think of it like a Tetris game, right? Where you have these different chunks kind of like stacking on top of each other. All right. And I provided here, this is something that can be a little bit like confusing for people to wrap their head around. And so I provided, you can just pause the video right now if you want. I've provided these quotes from a few other sources which talk about document flow. And so you can pause the video and just kind of read through those if you'd like. All right, so those are some terms you need to know. And I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. So if I'm using some of those terms, you understand what I'm talking about. And then also when I use elements and tags just loosey-goosey, you understand that, okay, you know what that is and you know what the difference is, and that it's really 2 and 1/2 a dozen the other, which is not the right way to say that, but that's the way I learned it when I was a kid. It's actually 6 and 1/2 a dozen the other, something like that. I don't know. It just means they're the same. All right. Now I just want to give you a little bit more information. So this little outline deal right here, right? So this page doesn't have a great outline, but that's okay because it's just Google Drive document. You could get the Chrome plugin HTML5 Outliner. Highly recommend you go get it. Highly recommend you're using Chrome, right? So I add that to Chrome, and then I have that little deal up there which I could click. There's a nice article here to read about document outlines. There are some cool statistics here about search engines. Just when I was doing some research on this, I was like, well, that's totally cool. I wanted to pass that on because really the most popular search engine is Google, 66% market share. 1.1 billion users, unique users every month are using Google versus Bing, which is only 350 million. Interesting story about Bing. When they first started running Bing, they were stealing their search results from Google. So they basically cached search results for different searches. And then when people searched Bing, they just fed back and reformatted what they'd gotten from Google for those searches. Kind of funny. All right. And then up here, this just talks about, why we want to structure our document. So you could sort of like pause the video here also and read through that. But that's pretty much everything I've already said. We're going to create our sections, then we'll create our outline. Some of what we do with our sections is going to inform our outline. Some of it won't. But those are 2 specific steps. And then we're going to do our layout, right? And we'll use Semantic HTML as much as possible to create our sections and influence our outline. All right. Last thing is, why do you want to have good document structure and have an outline? Because that's going to increase your search engine rank. It'll also make your site more accessible. And then I didn't mention this, I'm going to mention it right now. It'll make your site more maintainable. So it makes your code more readable, and it's going to be easier for you to understand when you come back to it, and it'll be easier for other people who inherit your code to use it. So some cool stuff coming up. And in the next video, we're going to start looking at Semantic HTML. And then after that, we're actually going to start applying what we're learning and start sectioning up some documents.